language is full of metaphors that we use without even realizing that they are metaphors. So we can say, for example, I am in a bad mood today, and it seems a completely literal statement. However, when we say that we are in a bad mood, we are conceptualizing emotions and the mood as if it was a container and we were inside it. So this is a very conventional metaphor. We don't even realize it's a metaphor. But creatively, we can derive new expressions related to the same conceptual metaphor. So we can say, I am in a bad mood, but I'm trying to climb out of it. Okay, and that's a creative elaboration of a conventional statement. And so there is a very tight connection between metaphors and creativity, and especially in language, but also in images, we can very easily create new extensions of conventional metaphors, as well as we can create very new metaphors from scratch by simply comparing two very distant concepts.
I think a conventional metaphor is a metaphor that we are all used to saying. We might not even notice that it's a metaphor. So things like, we might say, for example, that I'm looking forward to tomorrow. We're not actually literally looking forward at all, but that kind of has this idea that tomorrow is somehow in front of us and we can see it. Or we might look back in anger at the past. So these are so conventional that a lot of people might even think that they're not even metaphors. We have a conventional metaphor where you kind of like you might describe something that's problematic or difficult as like a minefield, and like you're walking through a minefield. We had someone talking about his job. He said, I'm having to guide this super tanker through the minefields of the office. He's picking that conventional metaphor and bringing in this idea of a super tanker. So it's bringing in this massive exaggeration or hyperbole. And it's a bit odd because you probably wouldn't have a super tanker in a minefield, so it doesn't really work kind of logically, but it does work metaphorically.
An optimal innovation innovate something that has been conventionalized for a long time, so that the result is something innovative, which also echoes or resonates with the familiar. Curl up and die, in the sense of the idiomatic expression, is, being depressed and wishing to die. But then you could de-automatize it by changing the spelling of die. Curl up becomes literal, and die becomes literal, and that literal expression is the optimal innovation.
I think we've got the same set of principles across all languages and the same ways of doing creativity across all languages. We might find that because of the way some languages are made up, there might be more opportunities for some types of creative metaphor. In Japan, there's a lot of onomatopoeia, in Japanese, for example, so that could be a kind of metaphor in kind of relating the sound to the meaning. In German, words combine to make great big long words, so there's often there's a lot of metaphor in the etymology of words, in the way words develop, and so that's perhaps an opportunity there. Maybe some languages, it may be easier to form puns if there are more words that sound like each other. But I'm not aware of any research that shows like one language is like more creative than another. But I think they all exploit the same set of devices in different ways.
If we think of music, of course, we think of maybe composing a piece as a creative process. But what I look at is how do we describe the music, and maybe also how do we describe the creative process. And while you can describe the music in a really creative sense, I don't know, I have examples where a critic compares the music to vegetables, yeah, and like Beethoven is easily edible, whereas contemporary stuff is really hard to digest. So that's really creative. But what I focus on is sort of the less creative expressions and how they sort of lose their metaphoricity over repeated usage. In terms of pitch, we talk about low pitch and high pitch. And then if we talk about pitches in a musical piece, they make up melodies, and they can rise, or they can fall, they can ascend, they can descend. And also in a bigger picture context, the music can approach a climax, and it can sort of recline from a certain conceptual format.
Metaphor is really woven into the very fabric of language, and it is, of course, the stuff of poetry. It's enormously rich, it appeals to the imagination, it affects our emotions very directly, and poets use metaphor to make us see familiar things in new ways. So the poem, I'd like to just read the last few lines, a poem called Ariel by the American poet Sylvia Plath, sees the sunrise, or allows us to see the sunrise through the eyes of a human rider, the I in the poem. I am the arrow, the dew that flies suicidal, at one with the drive into the red eye, the cauldron of morning. The person, the I, is here equating herself with an arrow and with the dew. At the same time, the sun is seen as an I. So we have that sound correspondence, which sets up a correspondence that is then very multifaceted within the poem. And the cauldron of morning then takes this further. So you can see that metaphor here is operating at a number of different levels and also operating through sound. And this is probably not something that we would really want to analyze in scientific ways. It's something that we appreciate. Emotionally, we understand that there is this drive of the I who is in emotional turmoil, but also riding, and therefore the motion of the body and the emotion within becomes one through the power of metaphor.
We say that creativity requires potential, originality, and effectiveness. Sometimes this potential is realized and you have creative achievement. And sometimes that is not, and you have what we call creative inconclusiveness. Metaphor plays a role in very different ways and different parts of this process. Just to give you an example, we could say you want to have new ideas to design a coffee machine. And you might draw inspiration from anything which has no relationship with coffee machines. Let's say a coffee machine is a planet. It doesn't make any sense, so there's no meaning to that, which means it's a good starting point because nobody else has ever said a coffee machine is a planet. So if you're able in retrospect, in hindsight, to find meaning to that, to give meaning to that, you have a good chance to find a new design. So the metaphor, we find it super useful in this process, actually.
Saying that a coffee machine is a planet might sound very weird at first, but if we put enough thought into it, we might come up with a plausible explanation. So in one of our psycholinguistic studies, we're interested in seeing whether there are any differences between very creative and less creative metaphors that come from the famous study by Katz and others from 1980s. So in our experiment, we compared less creative metaphors like mosquito is a vampire, which is very easy to understand, to something like creativity is a toaster, which is very difficult to understand. However, if you put enough thought into it again, you will be able to come up with a solution. So you'll say something like, oh, you put stuff in, stuff comes out, and it's even better. You see, creativity is just like a toaster. So the groups that we tested were bilinguals, language learners, and monolingual speakers of English. And so the reason why we tested these groups is because there's previous research that shows that bilinguals tend to be more creative and more flexible with their language than monolinguals tend to be. So we want to see whether in the case of creative metaphors, whether there's any difference in processing in these three different groups. So to do this, we ran a reading study, which was followed by a comprehension task. And the question was, does this sentence make sense? So what we're interested in seeing is whether there is any difference in reading times, but also, are the bilingual speakers and language learners going to be more lenient in saying that what is creative actually does make sense?
So, researchers from all around the world are currently investigating the interconnection between metaphor and creativity and how metaphors can enhance and help processes of creative thinking, which in turn can help humankind to progress and to foster innovation, basically. And so, how are metaphors used to foster innovation? It's a very impactful, potentially a very impactful field of research that can have consequences on a variety of applicative fields such as education, industrial design, how metaphors help us create new ideas in service design, even architecture, robotics, and so on. So the power of creative thinking and metaphors in creative thinking has no limit, actually.